This video is sponsored by Rive. Rive is a relatively new design and animation app that has a lot of really exciting animation and interactive capabilities that just don't exist in After Effects. And as an After Effects user, it is surprisingly easy to pick up. I taught myself how to use it over just a few days and only had to reference the user guide a couple of times. Plus, it's totally free to try out. As of this recording, the free plan gives you 3 project files, so you can get in there, see what it's all about, and add a new app to your toolbox. Over the course of a couple videos, it's my personal goal to get you into Rive, comfortable with the interface and workflow, and have you successfully create your first 3 Rive animations. I've even put together a PDF full of keyboard shortcuts and other great tips to keep you working efficiently in Rive. You can get that PDF for free down in the description. Now let's take a look at what we're gonna create in this video. This is the animation that we'll be recreating in Rive. It's a very simple animation for BeatGrid, one of our BattleAxe freebies. You can actually go see the final Rive animation on the BattleAxe website if you're interested in seeing what a Rive animation looks like on the web. But it's a very simple project to recreate inside of Rive, and it's a great first step moving from After Effects into building things in Rive and making them move. So let's jump into Rive, and I'm going to make a new file. And I'm going to choose the blank artboard template and make this 900 by 900 because I know that's the destination size for this animation. So that's something you should probably think about, but you can always adjust the artboard size after you create it. Here we are in Rive. It's got a pretty simple interface. It's very similar to Figma if you have any experience with that. It also has a lot of parallels to Illustrator. I kind of like to think of it like an Illustrator or Figma with a timeline. So we're going to start by just renaming the file. Double click on the file tab up here, and I'm going to call this BeatGrid. And I'm going to come to my artboard and double click right there as well and call this BeatGrid. This is going to be the artboard that I render from. You can think of artboards kind of like compositions in After Effects. So first of all, I want to grab that green background that I had in After Effects. So let's jump back here. I'll grab that green hex code value, copy it over, and in Rive, I can actually just change the background color of the artboard. So over here, we're gonna see properties, very similar to the properties panel in After Effects. I'm just gonna double click on that hex code, paste and press enter, and we've got our green background. The next element that I wanna design are these lines that are static, the horizontal lines. So I'm gonna come over here, and also before we even get any further, I wanna point out that I'm on the design tab. There's also an animate tab. It's important that we design things in the design tab and animate in the animate tab. That'll make more sense later. Just make sure you're on the design tab. There's also a lot of navigation parallels between apps. If you hold spacebar, you can pan around, zoom in and out by pressing controller command and the plus and minus, or you could even hold controller command and zoom with your mouse wheel. You can even hold down the middle mouse button to temporarily pan around. So lots of really simple navigation parallels between apps here. I'm going to fit my artboard into view by pressing the F key, and that just zooms it to the entire canvas. And now let's make a rectangle. So I'm gonna come over to the pen tool, click and hold, get to my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to click and drag anywhere in my artboard here. So it doesn't really matter where because I can immediately align it to the center of the artboard with this align panel set of tools. And I'm going to change the fill. Actually, I don't want to fill. I'll right click on it and say delete. Click the plus next to the stroke, and we need the stroke color. So once again, jump back into After Effects, grab this hex value for one of the lines and paste that right in here. And I think I'll bump this up to 2 just so we can see those lines a little bit more clearly. It's okay that this is going outside the bounds of the artboard. I'm just using them as 2 lines. I just need to make sure that I make it the right height. I want it to be half the height of the artboard, which would be 450. So now those are perfectly aligned where they should be. And I'm going to rename it over here, horizontal lines, and then I'll just duplicate this shape with Controller Command D. I'll call this one center line, and I'll change the height to be 0. So I'm using a rectangle shape, but creating a line from it. So now I have my 3 horizontal lines, and let's go ahead and just group these together over in our hierarchy. The hierarchy you can kind of think of like a layers panel. All of our assets, everything we create is going to show up in there. We have our artboard at the top of the hierarchy, and then our shape layers down inside of it. With them selected, Controller Command G to group, and I'll call this horizontal lines, and I'm gonna go ahead and lock it so I don't accidentally move them around. Now I can't select them, we're good to go. Next, let's build the vertical line that we'll be animating across the screen. So I'm gonna zoom out here and move over, and I'm going to make a new artboard for this animated element. So up here is my arrangement tools. I'm going to click and hold and switch to my artboard tool, and then click and drag while holding shift to make this a square. Again, precision doesn't really matter because I can change the sizing right here. I want this to be the same size, 900 by 900. I'll put it at 0 on the Y and maybe just move it over a little bit. Let's rename this artboard vertical line, and we can get to work. So first of all, doesn't need a fill color on this artboard, so I'll right click and delete that. And now we'll have a transparent background. Let's press R to get to our rectangle tool, click and drag somewhere in the artboard. Again, precision doesn't really matter because I can change everything about it right here. So the size width should be 0. Let's put the height at 900, the full height of the artboard. The fill, we're gonna get rid of that. And I should still have the hex code copied. Sure enough, there it is. So I've got that same gray color. I'll bump it up to 2. Now what I wanna point out is that I'm putting this element kind of right in the center of the artboard. I'm thinking of this kind of like the default state. And when we go into the animate mode, in fact, I'll just do that right now, Rive is going to look at however we designed this artboard as its default state, which is what we need to move on to right now. So switch over to your animate mode, and we're going to see this state machine down here, which looks a little bit scary. It's node-based. It's really not scary, but we're not gonna get that much into it in this tutorial. What I really wanna see is this timeline right here. So click on timeline 1, and you're gonna see a very familiar looking timeline, and we can start making things move. Now, one thing that you do need to wrap your head around is that Rive doesn't really have a frame rate. When it goes to play back your animations at runtime, whether it's on the web or on an app, it's basically going to play it back as quickly as it can, which is why I'm recording this tutorial at 60 frames per second. You'll be able to see just how smooth the animations are best if you go view something that's actually a Rive animation on a website, like the Battle Axe website. If you go to our product pages, like the Beat Grid tool, you will see just how buttery smooth the animation is. So definitely go check that out, but that is something you have to wrap your head around inside of Rive. There are ways for us to work in increments of frames, the way that we're used to in After Effects or Premiere or other time-based tools. But just remember that Rive is not really going to play them back at that frame rate. It's just allowing you to work in those incremented values and allows you to set keyframes at those frame rates. So let's take a look at how to set up this timeline to work the way we want it to. First of all is this time drop down. If I click on it, snap keys is the property that is essentially the frame rate of the timeline. So let me change this to 30 because I don't want to work at 60. I made this at 30 in After Effects. So I'm just gonna drop that down to 30, and I'm gonna change the duration. It defaults to 1 second. It just cut that in half since I dropped the snap keys value, but I'm just gonna give myself plenty of time. We'll say 5.5 seconds, and we have this little zoom tool right here that lets us move around our timeline just like in After Effects. So now we have plenty of time to work with, and I know that I want to animate this line in 20 frame increments. The first keyframe that I want set though is to have this line on the right side of the artboard and completely shrunk down so that its height is set to 0. Because this element was designed at the center of the artboard, as soon as I moved it, we got a keyframe down here and there's a keyframe set up here. It's going to auto key based on that default state that you designed the elements at. So I've already got my position keyframe there. To change the height, I'm just gonna click on height and I'm gonna change that down to 0, and that will also automatically add a keyframe. But if I go back to my state machine, you'll see that it jumps back to its default state that we designed at. So just keep that in mind. We're gonna animate in this timeline 1 though. Now that I have my first state of that line over on the right side, I'm gonna jump forward 20 frames, which I could do by clicking and dragging and looking at the time code, or I could use the keyboard shortcut of Shift period to go 10 frames forward. So period goes forward by 10 frame increments, comma goes backwards by 10 frame increments. So let's go 20 frames forward, and I wanna move this out to 225 pixels further than it was basically. So I'm gonna undo that and instead just type in after 900 minus 225, press enter. Now my line is there, and I need to grow this up to half the size of the artboard's height, which would be 450. The artboard is 900. So now we're going to animate between those two states, and I can go 20 frames forward again, move this to the center of the composition, change the height up to 900, go 20 frames forward, move this over to 225 on the X, drop the height back down to 450, go 20 frames forward again, set this to the left side. Actually, let's just change this down to 0, and then change this down to 0 as well. And now this line is going to play back, growing and then moving across to the left of the artboard. So that's great. Our animation's duration is 2 seconds and 20 frames. I'm gonna go ahead and trim down my timeline to that same duration. So I'm just gonna copy that current and paste it into duration. And now our timeline will end at that point. But that keyframe, that's right where I want it to loop. And to get this to play back in a loop, I can click on this little drop down here and change it from one shot, where it just plays through once, to loop. You could also do ping pong, which is cool. It'll go back and forth in both directions, but I just wanna loop this. So I'm gonna play it, and now it's going to play through those keyframes and immediately loop again. So we've built our first animated element, and I now need to get this back into our main artboard. So let's jump over to our beat grid artboard and make it active by clicking on it. You can tell it's active because of the dot next to the name of the artboard. That will tell you which artboard you're active in. And let's bring that vertical line artboard into this one using our nested artboard tool. Now this is going to be renamed components. It might even be renamed by the time you're watching this video, but just keep in mind, this is a beta version of the app. You can always click on this right here to see the changelog, see what's been updated, but things are changing and improving all the time. So we're gonna go to the component, we're going to click on our artboard, and it's gonna give us a drop down of all of the available artboards. Vertical line is the only one that we have access to outside of this one, so I'm gonna click on that. And I wanna move this to the top left corner, but I need to be careful because I'm currently in the timeline, not in the state machine. And remember, however we've designed this is the way that Rive will reference its default value. So if I were to move this, it's going to add a position keyframe, and I don't want that. So I need to make sure I go back to the state machine and then move this position to the top left corner, and no keyframes have been added now. The state machine is the default values for all the assets in this artboard. Now this is aligned, and if I press the space bar on my state machine, we're gonna see that same animation go through. But it's a very linear animation. It doesn't look like what I had in After Effects. So we actually need to jump back to the vertical line. Let's click on that artboard and move over here, grab that timeline, and I need to change the easing between all of these keyframes so that it matches what we had in After Effects. And there actually is a graph editor in here. If I click on this button, I could modify things just like the value graph in After Effects, but I think there's an even easier way and a better feature of Rive built in right down here in the bottom right corner. This is the interpolation section, and it's very similar to Flow, the third-party tool for After Effects. If I click on this button right here, it's gonna give me a cubic easing value with some Bezier handles. I can click and drag these, hold shift to snap it. Very, very familiar value graph based style of easing. And I also have these values down here, which if we jump back to After Effects, under Flow, I have the exact same type of controls here and values. If I were to grab two values here, any two pairs of keyframes down here and click on read values, it's going to bring in those values, and I can see I've got 0.88 and 0.34. I can transfer these over to Rive. Let's just make sure all of our keyframes are selected. Click into here and say 0.88, 0.34 and press enter. I've got the exact same easing curve, and if I play this back, there's my easing recreated right here in Rive. And if I jump back to my main beat grid artboard on the state machine and play it back, we're gonna see that reflected here as well. Now what I need to do is just duplicate this element a few different times and offset the timing of each copy. So I'm going to grab this vertical line and I'm going to rename it vertical line 1, and I'll group it just to keep my hierarchy nice and clean. We'll call this vertical lines. And let's go inside of that one, and I need to make some modifications to this. Over in our properties over here, there's an animation section, and it's playing back the state machine from that artboard by default. I want to actually get rid of that, so I'm going to right click on it and say delete, and click the plus button and choose timeline 1 from within that artboard and choose remap as the option. This is very similar to time remapping in After Effects. If I click on the little settings drop down, it's going to give me a time percentage value. So I can set keyframes on this value from 0 to 100%. But in order to set a keyframe, I need to go to the timeline of this artboard, not the state machine. And we need to make sure that this is set up correctly. It's still set to 60 frames per second. Let's drop that down to 30, and let's change the duration again to something bigger than we need, let's say 4 seconds, and zoom out a little bit so we can see more. But on this first frame, I want to set a keyframe on that vertical line 1 timeline time value. So I'll click on that keyframe button to set a 0% value at that point in time, and then go forward to 2 seconds and 20 frames because that's the length of the timeline. And I'll set a 100% value on that time property. So 100%, and now this is going to play back just like it was in the other artboard. But because it's now set up with keyframes, I can modify the timing with multiple copies. So I'll duplicate this with Controller Command D, change this to vertical line 2, and now it shows up in the timeline as a separate set of keyframes, and I can shift the keyframes forward 10 frames at a time by holding Alt or Option Shift period twice. So that goes 10, 20 frames forward, and now we have 2 lines. I'm gonna do this 2 more times to have a total of 4 elements, each offset by 20 frames in time. So let's do that one more time. Vertical line 4, grab those keyframes. And now we have all the elements that we need. I just need to loop between here and here. So to do that, we're going to set a work area, just like in After Effects. I'll go to this drop-down menu one more time. I'm gonna check that on, and here's my work area. I'm gonna move this forward in time, the end point of the work area. Find the out point and move that to right here. And now if I press play, it's just going to play back between that work area, but I want it to loop. So let's go back there, change it from 1 shot to loop, and it will now seamlessly play that forever. This is great. We've got our first animated looping element set up, and we can move on to the circle, diamond, square shape. So let's zoom out a little bit, and we need to make another artboard. Since this one is already set up with the timeline settings that I want, I'm just going to duplicate it by holding down Alt or Option, clicking and dragging on this arrow and dragging it down here. And I'll just rename this circle square. And the rectangle we're using to make up this line can actually be reused for this second element. So really what I want to do is just remove all of these keyframes, select it and press delete. That doesn't delete the element, just the keyframes. And I'll go back to my state machine, switch over to the design mode, and let's zoom back in here so we can see this artboard a little bit more clearly. So again, we're working back in design mode. We're laying out what this should look like in its default state. So I want to change the size of this to basically the first animated state. So not completely disappeared, but the first state as this circle grows out. And since I've already made this animation, I know what all of these values should be, but I want to change the rectangle size to 319 by 319. And I want to change the rotation to be 45 degrees, so it's a diamond shape. This will be the default state for this shape. So let's go back into animate mode, switch to timeline 1, which should still be set to 30 frames per second, same duration as before, and it will loop. So that's great. Now let's go ahead and set some default keys on these values 20 frames forward. So I'll go to 20 frames, I'll set a rotation keyframe and the width and height. So now we have those keyframes set at that point in time. I'll back up and modify some of these values. So I want the rotation to go back to 0, and I want the size to go down to 0 on both the X and Y. And this is all gonna be symmetrical, so I'm gonna link those up so those two values always change together. But now it's going to rotate out and scale up. But it stays that rectangle shape with those pointed corners the entire time. I need to also add in corner roundness values right here. So on this second state, I don't want any roundness, so I'll set a keyframe there. But back on the first keyframe, on the first frame of the animation, let's increase this to half of 319. So we'll say 319 divided by 2, and that gives me 159.5. Let's just round that to 160. And now we should see a circle that turns into a square. Now that roundness is making this stay a perfect circle until this point, so I think we probably need to modify that. Let's go into the path, corner radius, and let's see on that value, it's set to 160. Let's turn that down to maybe 20. And see how that looks. So now if I play this back and let's zoom in here nice and close, it's staying a circle for less time and turning into a rectangle more quickly. I think 20 might be a little too short. Let's change that to 60. And yeah, I think that might be a good value to start with. Let's zoom back out and go 20 more frames forward. So shift period, period, and we'll rotate this another 45 degrees to 90 and then double the width and the height. So I'll just say times 2. We've got a bigger rectangle now, and I need to change the corner radius up to half of that value. So I'll say 638 divided by 2, and now that's gonna give it a perfect corner radius to make it a circle. So we're getting an animation that goes from nothing to a rectangle diamond shape to a circle. Let's go 20 frames forward again. Add 319 to the size, so plus 319. We'll change the corner radius down to 0 and rotate it another 45 degrees. And then finally, one more time, 20 frames forward. We'll increase it by another 319, rotate it by another 45, and change the corner radius to be half the width. So 1276 divided by 2. There we go. And that should finish off the animation. So let's play that back. Again, there are no easing values, so this is all very linear. Let's make that cubic, change this to 88 by 34. And we should see the same easing on this animation as we did with the other lines, and sure enough, we do. Great, so we've got our second animated element. Now we need to get that into our main artboard the exact same way that we did with the vertical lines. So let's jump back to our design mode, make this bigger, and we're going to do the exact same process as before. Go to our component tool, click once, and now we have the option of either of our other artboards. I'll choose circle square, move it to the top left corner, and we can get rid of the state machine animations. I'm just gonna right click and delete it, add the timeline 1 remap option, and we're going to set our keyframe. So let's get back into our animate mode, make sure we're on timeline 1, go to the start of the timeline, and that's where we'll set our first time keyframe at a value of 0, move forward to 2 seconds and 20 frames, and increase that value up to 100%. And this process is exactly the same as what we had with the vertical line. So I'm going to again group the circle square into its own hierarchy group. We'll call this circle squares, and we'll go inside and rename this circle square 1, then duplicate it, rename it to 2, and offset the keyframes 20 frames forward in time. Then just repeat that process 2 more times. Shift these forward, duplicate 1 more time, that's number 4, and shift these forward. And now this should loop seamlessly between that work area in and out point. And sure enough, there we go. We've successfully recreated this animation. And playing it in the state machine, it's gonna give us the same thing as what we have in the timeline, because that's what we've got set up in the state machine. But as far as sharing this animation goes, if you're not ready to share an actual Rive animation on a website or in an app, something like that, you can still share this as a video file. So if we come up to this menu right here and we go down to add to render queue, it's going to open up the render queue and give us some options. So since I was in the animate mode with this timeline, it defaulted the mode to animation, but you can also export it as a design. I'll leave it as animation. We've got the artboard selection right there, the timeline within that artboard, and then we can choose the format. So PNG sequence, H.264, you can do whatever you want, even a GIF here, but you can also change the frame rate. So if you want to export this at 60 frames per second, you can, or if you want to keep it at 30, or even drop it down to 24. It's totally up to you. You can even change the playback speed and control some of the compression settings. Once you have it done, just click on play. It's gonna send it over to the render queue. This is done on the web, and once it's done, it's going to show up in completed, where you can download it and play it back yourself. Share it on social media, do whatever you want with it, but that is how you get up and running with animation inside of Rive. Let me know what you thought about this tutorial and what else you'd like to learn about Rive. There are more Rive tutorials coming to my channel, so make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss out. And also don't forget that there's a PDF down in the description that you can download for free to help you as you're getting comfortable with Rive. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.